Good morning, everyone. I hope you all had a good rest yesterday, and welcome to the morning session. Welcome to all of those as well joining the live stream of this session. This is another session of the Academy which is being live streamed with socialprotection.org. So in this session we're going to have Natalia Windarossi from the FAO, sharing, as you can see, some insights around social protection, food, nutrition, rural livelihoods, and resilience. And this is very much part of the partnership with the FAO in implementing the Academy, because, as I say, the FAO are a partner in delivering the Academy. Now, Natalia is a senior social protection specialist at the FAO. She both leads the global social protection team in the FAO in Rome, and is also a senior advisor for the Rural Poverty and Resilience Strategic Programs. Prior to joining the FAO, she also worked for many years in UNICEF as a senior social protection specialist, and amongst other things was involved in drafting UNICEF's social protection strategic framework. So Natalia is clearly someone with a wealth of experience in this field. Maybe just to locate this session a little bit within the kind of sequence of the week, I think from since Monday afternoon, we've had a number of sessions, and this is, I guess, the last of the sessions, which is really trying to look at the rationale, the logic for social protection, and what it's trying to contribute to. We had the research session, which unpacked a number of issues across the life course in particular. We looked at the impacts yesterday, and now we're really digging a bit deeper in these links to food security and nutrition, but also issues of livelihoods and resilience, shock responsiveness, which I think is a really important dimension that Natalia is going to be able to bring out. So, without further ado, I would also just mention that we're going to be using the Slido again for the Q&A. So please, you can begin as the presentation goes forward. If you start to have questions, start to send them through. Vote on which ones you think are the ones that collectively you think are of most interest, and we'll work through them a bit later. Okay, brilliant.
Good morning, bonjour, bon dia. Thank you very much, Charles and Charles, for the invitation. It's always a pleasure for me and for FAO to be here joining the Social Security Academy. I understand that there's colleagues that are following us via live stream, so also welcome to them. I hope everybody's awake, ready to go. I understand that yesterday you had a very exciting party, which I missed. But hopefully this morning you will get also as excited with the things that we're going to discuss this morning. So what I wanted to do this morning is to first give an overview of why, from FAO's perspective, social protection is key and relevant for food security, nutrition, agriculture, and rural development in general. Give you a little of a sneak peek to the elective course that you will be having next week, really focusing on the linkages between social protection and agriculture, social protection and food security, going more in depth, not only around the rationale, but most importantly on how do we make these linkages happen in real terms, in programmatic terms. A little bit about the evidence. This is not just a conceptual linkage, but it's really much grounded in the evidence around how social protection is also able to generate economic and productive impacts. I also wanted to discuss a little bit the issue about social protection and resilience, which I think it became much more relevant in the recent years, given unfortunately, the number and the complexity of crises across the world. And then, once we're all convinced how social protection is key for rural development, reflect a bit on the challenges we still are facing in terms of access, particularly in rural areas. And bear with me because I'm technologically challenged. So despite the fact that I think across regions there's been some important progress in terms of poverty reduction, we still have a very big challenge. More than 783 million people still live in extreme poverty. And most of them are in rural areas, and most of them depend, at least partly, on agriculture. And when I talk about agriculture, I'm not talking just on crops, but of course in the broader agriculture sectors, including fisheries, forests, and others. We know, and I think probably this is something that you've been discussing in other sessions, that within the whole group of rural development, we also have specific groups that face additional vulnerabilities and issues, including women, youth, migrants, older persons, and which within the rural sector, you add additional constraints and vulnerabilities. And I think in our current context, we add to that dynamic the additional risks and constraints posed by climate-related risks and, of course, exacerbating conflict. It was this last year that we launched what we call the State of Food Insecurity. It's a joint effort between FAO, WFP, UNICEF, and other partners, where we're trying to make sense on, what is the state of food insecurity. And it's very obvious that there's two big messages. One, that hunger is on the rise, as well as malnutrition. And one of the main causes for this rise is the increasing number of climate-related risks and conflicts. So particularly in those areas where they are, experiencing a mixed dynamic between climate change and increasing conflict that's also affecting not only lives, but also the overall food security of communities. When I talk about farmers, and I use, again, farmers in a very broad sense of the way, including different livelihoods, we use in FAO a very simplified typology to understand that it's not an heterogeneous sector, that we're talking about different kind of farmers, different type of groups with different dynamics. We have, the medium and large-scale commercial activities. We have those that are engaged in much more smaller, but also very profitable type of commercial activities. And then we have two groups where FAO has put a lot of effort in supporting, which is the emerging small-scale farmers, as well as those that are mainly doing subsistence activities, therefore producing for their own consumption. And it's in the last two groups that I've highlighted where I think we put a lot of emphasis in making sure that at least those groups have access to adequate social protection. The four groups have the right to social protection and have to access them, but I think we put a lot of emphasis in making sure that to a minimum, the poorest and the most excluded have access to relevant social protection programs. What are the characteristics of this latter groups? There's a big emphasis around family labor. So a lot of the activities are operated by the family in a farm, in a community. Most of them depend, as I mentioned, on agriculture for subsistence. They tend to utilize very low-skill, low-return livelihood strategies. So there's very little investment in enhancing the productivity or the value added of crops. It's a very low-risk, low-scale type intervention. There's a lot of difficulty in accessing the market in terms of in the labor market as well as the credit market, financial services. There's a lot of constraint given, of course, the lack of collateral and the lack of resources. A big share of the income that they are producing is invested on food, with very little space to then invest resources in other productive interventions. There is a very strong interdependence between consumption and production. And I think that's a very key message or idea to bear in mind. In order to enhance your economic potential, you need to be able to invest some of your income, not only in eating, in investing in your kids' well-being, but also to have some resources to start investing in productive interventions. For some of these families, that is not an option. It's actually a choice, an impossible choice. Do I feed my kids better, or do I invest in my farm and my land? And we've identified different pathways out of poverty, right? Those that are just continuing in the agriculture path, and therefore there has to be a stronger investment in identifying opportunities for them to get inserted into the agriculture sector. Others are going to choose through the diversification path. So agriculture is part of our income, but not the bulk of it, and therefore identify different other options. And what are those options that we can also put in the table around non-farm activities? For instance, in many areas in Latin America, the definition or the difference between urban and rural settings is very blurry. We're talking about urban-rural interlinkages and new opportunities that are coming because of new sectors that have been opened. How can we make sure that those in the rural sector per se can take advantage of these new markets that are being created through those interlinkages? And others that are going to choose to exit agriculture, to go through a different type of rural transformation and move to different types of activities. And in all of those different pathways, we've identified that social protection plays a role. either in helping that move, that migration, that change in activity, either for those that are staying, that are not able to migrate to the urban sectors or do not want to migrate in the rural sectors, how to make sure that you continue to having a decent livelihood and risk management strategy. But of course, this is combined with many factors in addition to the process and the environment around this, where these communities developed. We've put a lot of emphasis in FAO in identifying how can we develop a strategy around reducing rural poverty with the specificities of the rural sector. Not just poverty in general, saying that growth is important, but what are the specific characteristics and gaps that those living in the rural sector face and that require much more targeted and specific interventions. And within a very broad set of policies, which I've listed some of them, building and scaling up social protection linkages, as well as linking social protection programs with the broader agriculture sector becomes a key pillar of that strategy. And this is what I hope that it will be one of the main take-out messages of this sector, particularly for us that we're working or that come from the social sectors where social protection is seen very much linked with education, with health, with children's development. There's also another sector, which is the agriculture sector, that is very much part and a big contributor of a much more broader and systems approach around social protection, particularly relevant, of course, for the rural sectors. And there you go. So that's, I mean, to frame the reason why an organization working in agriculture and food security started to work around social protection issues. Based not only in this conceptual understanding on the importance of social dimensions to really reach, sustainable livelihoods, but also with a very strong commitment around the right to food and the right to social protection and their interlinkages between the two. We see, and I think this is a perspective that we share across different organizations working in social protection, that we have to see it from its broader definition, and I'm sure that in the initial sessions, we've been discussing the different definitions around social protection. And I wanted to maybe discuss it in a much more, in a functional way, At a minimum, we're talking about a risk management strategy. Being able to have access to predictable transfers or to a safety net or to predictable pensions can allow you to manage risk, to reduce the negative coping mechanisms that sometimes we are forced to resort to in the event of a crisis or a shock. For example, pulling kids out of school, for example, selling off our productive assets or others. If I have predictable access to social protection, those coping mechanisms can be minimized, not reduced, not eliminated, but definitely minimized. It's, as I was trying to explain in the previous slide, it's a core part of poverty reduction. Even though social protection is a right, even though it's a universal approach, it also has a very specific component and contribution around reducing poverty. And as I will try to explain, particularly relevant for rural areas. It's a strategy to eliminate hunger as people are more able to access food, and not only more, but better. Helping to reduce some of the economic barriers that those in the rural sectors face when accessing basic social services. And I'm sure that my colleagues in UNICEF have had a very long discussion around those very clear impacts. But for us as an agriculture agency, it was clear that it was also a strategy for inclusive growth. And this is, again, a key message to bear in mind. Even the poorest, even the labor constrained, even those that are excluded from markets and from economic processes have the economic and productive potential. They're able to contribute to a local economy if they're provided with the means to do so. In addition to the social impacts that we very well know, there's also very clear economic and productive impacts. We see it as a way from progressively moving communities from protection to production and eventually, hopefully, to productivity. With a very strong also component around empowerment, we're also providing or helping poor and excluded families to design the way that they want to move, that they want to strengthen their livelihoods, right? It's trying to provide support to enhance capacities that are already inherently around these communities. And we've seen it, we have, of course, identified the social perspective, but of course our work is very much focusing on trying to maximize this productive and economic potential that a social program such as cash transfers, such as school feeding, such as others can have. For many years, the organizations like the one I work with were very much focused on the sector, how to enhance the productivity of the agriculture sector, how to revitalize markets, how to really make sure that the sector itself is able to produce more and better. Recently, there's been, of course, a change in perspective, realizing that if you don't also address the social aspects of those that are producing the food, those that are part of that sector, changes in rural development are not going to be fulfilled. And there's where issues like nutrition, social inclusion, gender, but also social protection become a key component, a key strategy for the organization. But also from a humanitarian perspective, and it's something that I'll talk at some later in the presentation, we've also identified the role that a social protection system can play in being able to better deliver and effectively reach and respond to a particular crisis, either preventing or enhancing the capacity of vulnerable farmers to respond to a particular crisis, or to have a better response using existing systems. And I go a little more into detail later on. Going more into detail around what can social protection do in terms of helping farmers to become much more economic or more productive, if you want. We all know that there is a range of market failures in the rural sector, right? We know that there is, particularly in the agriculture sector, we know that there is volatility in the generation of income. We know that there are price fluctuations very much inherent around the sector itself. We know that the sector is very much affected and over-affected, if I may say, by specific climate-related shocks. We just had a couple of reports on the damage and loss created by climate-related risk on the sector. And agriculture absorbs 80% of all the impact related to drought, for example, or 25% of all the damage around the broad range of climate-related shocks. So we're talking about a very volatile sectors where, of course, those that have less assets, less income, and less protection are very obviously overrepresented around vulnerability. There's also very obvious limited access to the financial sector in terms of savings, in terms of credit. And that, it's not only detrimental by itself, but it's also it's a key barrier to moving from an investment that is subsistent, low risk, to something that could be a bit more productive. So making the change from some subsistence to productivity requires investment. And for some communities, there's barriers around accessing adequate investment around that. And clearly limited employment opportunities given the structure of the sector, the skills match, et cetera. How can social protection support? It's not, of course, the solution to all means, but it's definitely a contribution within a broader set of interventions. One is around the predictability I'm talking using the example, for instance, in this first bullet around cash transfers. Having a predictable access to income in the form of cash transfer can help farmers to smooth their consumption and therefore enhance the capacity to cope with crisis. They're better able to plan. If I know that every month I will be receiving an income or a support to my income, I can then plan what will be the best way to use those resources in terms of consumption, but also in terms of production. When we think about agriculture and weather shock insurance, even though not all insurance programs are social protection, we're talking about social insurance and some subsidies to be able to access much more complete package around insurance that can also provide support around protecting key assets that are at the core of their livelihoods. It's also a way of helping to generate additional employment opportunities. Again, it's not that a cash transfer is going to be invested in massive, productive investments, but it could definitely start to generate some initial entrepreneurial activities that with the adequate support can eventually become a source of income. And again, progressively moving people from a state of subsistence to a better stage of production. And I'm guessing that it was also discussed in some of the sessions around evidence and impacts, that in addition of creating key social and economic impacts in the participants of a social protection programs, it also is generating multiplier effects in the village economy or in the local economy that we work on. And this is by far one of the most strongest messages or arguments that we can put forth to government counterparts, particularly to our friends in the Ministry of Finance, around the importance of social protection. That is not only generating impacts to those that are vulnerable and in need and enhancing that economic capacity, but it's also generating more demand in markets and therefore catalyzing, if you want, additional movement in the market. So it's an investment that is benefiting a particular group of people, but also helping to support those that are not participating in programs. And I think it's a very powerful number that we can, and powerful argument that we can put forth as we move towards a very strong work around expanding social protection programs and hoping that governments invest their own resources in this scale up. And of course, in the context of climate-related risk, which is, as I mentioned, is particularly relevant for the agriculture sector, we have, unfortunately, in the event of shocks, and if you don't have access to a system such as social protection program, many of these communities are forced to resort to negative coping mechanisms. I lose a part of my assets. I need to still survive. I still need to eat, and therefore we have negative coping strategies, which are affecting my food security, the sector itself, as well as my productive potential. You know, decreasing dietary diversity, for example, over deforestation. I need to create more resources, so I go to the trees and I start to cut them. Or some of the activities that are linked with not looking at the sustainable practices that could be identified around the sector. If I have access to a social protection program, those can be effectively minimized, protecting assets as well as protecting food security of family members. Very interesting additional contribution is if I have access to predictable sources of income, I can also enhance my financial capacity to invest in new technologies that can be not only more productive, but also much more climate smart or sustainable. I'll give you an example. The government in Paraguay right now is using its existing conditional cash transfer program called Tecopora, adding a top-up to that program to provide participants the choice to use that top-up to plant trees in an area that was deforested. So it's given participants an additional source of income and therefore enhancing their productivity, as well as creating incentives to change their livelihood practices so they are also much more sustainable and climate smart. Using, addressing the economic barriers of changing to a particular risky, non-sustainable practice to something that it could be potentially better, not only for me as a household, but also for the community itself. When we were discussing, what were the different implications and results around social protection in the context of rural development, it was very clear around food security, it was very clear around risk management, but we also understood that it was important and a key contribution in terms of nutrition security, which, as you know, is a key part of the work that we do, but also of rights across this area. We know that social protection programs can help to address some of the economic and social determinants of malnutrition in a very progressive way. First, immediately ensuring access to food, so really having a strong impact around food security and food access. Contributing to dietary diversity, as people now have more expanding purchasing capacity to buy not only more but better food. Unfortunately, in many of our contexts, more quality food is much more expensive and not accessible to many communities. Removing some of the economic barriers, as I was mentioning before, to accessing key services that are linked to nutrition, including healthcare and nutrition services. And of course, minimizing some of the coping strategies that can affect food security and nutrition. But this is not automatic, and that's another, I think, key message to take out of these sessions, that in order to maximize some of the potential impacts of a social protection program, of a social program, we have to look very closely to the way that it's designed and the ways that it's implemented. We're not advocating to have, very specific design to respond to different outcomes, but making sure that if that's one of the objectives of your social protection programs, to have a closer look on how these are designed and implemented. In terms of nutrition per se, what are the indicators that I want to help change or modify? Is it just food security, or am I thinking about more long-term, for example, child-on-top prometics? And thinking about who are we reaching, who are we targeting, what are the different complementary interventions that we are identifying in terms of nutrition impacts. A couple of examples. The government of Ghana, and I don't know if there's representatives of Ghana here, they have a very big social assistance program, LEAP, which is targeting the poorest communities. But the government also wanted to make sure that in addition to having all the food security impacts, there was some way of also helping to enhance nutrition impacts. So we have a subset within the big social protection program only targeted to families with children in the first 1,000 days, as well as pregnant mothers. So changing a bit or having a subset of that program focusing on to a particular community, to a particular population, can also help to have additional impacts around, in this case, nutrition. Very similar process is being done with the government of Ethiopia, which also have put as one of the objectives of productive safety net, the PSNP, nutrition impacts, not only food security. And in addition to the cash that is provided, there's a design now of an integrated package of interventions that will help that cash is generating, again, not only food security, but also some impacts around nutrition. So a complementary package that includes nutrition-specific interventions, such as nutrition education, such as promotional activities around exclusive breastfeeding, but also a package around nutrition-sensitive agriculture to enhance the access of nutritious food to those communities. So I think we're getting to that, hopefully, to that understanding that we have a component, which is the social protection program, that is generating very strong impacts, very strong results, but also the need to have them integrated into broader policies so that those results and results can be maximized and taken to the next level. And I think also most importantly to make sure that the impacts that we're seeing around social protection can be sustained over time. I'm gonna have water for 2 seconds. We're still awake? Yes. Sorry. Okay. Very quiet. That's very that means that they're very concentrated or you're all asleep. And I know I'm going really, really fast because there's a lot of snapshots and a lot of ideas and different concepts. But as I said, this is a sneak peek into a broader, week course on this issue. And I just wanted to, put the flavor and the ideas and hopefully get your attention to sign up to the elective course if they're not already done so. I hope not. The other big area and very relevant area of work, not particular to real areas, but I think with a big focus because of the impact that climate and conflict generates in the agriculture sector, is around the importance of social protection in the context of resilience. As you know, we have increasing number of conflict across regions, and that are not only increasing in number, but also increasing in complexity. We have, the emerging and accelerated pace of climate-related risks, and therefore its impact around the agriculture sector. And at least half, or almost half of the poor live in countries that are affected by fragility, both climate or conflict-related crisis, or a mix, no? And despite, the generosity and the increase in humanitarian aid, usually they're not enough to be able to respond to those needs and to be able to effectively make sure that those affected are covered and protected. And most importantly, most of those responses are short-term, looking at response, at saving lives, without looking at maybe a medium-term or long-term perspective. Saving lives is critical. It's the main, objective in a humanitarian crisis, but we also need to think about saving livelihoods, which in the process of reconstruction and the process of coming out of a crisis, we need to then start thinking about how do we protect those assets that will help me to then recover fast around it. I think social protection, if it's developed and designed properly, can provide two, let's say, two contributions. One is within the households per se, the households that are impacted and affected by different types of risks in terms of conflict and climate, to better cope and withstand the different crises, to have more capacity to respond, and when they bounce back, that they're not as bad as they were before. Reducing and helping also to reduce their exposure to some of this risk, for example, diversifying their asset base, or supporting the mitigation of some of this impacts, as well at community level as well as at household level. As I was saying before, to help families to move to more climate-smart type interventions that are also going to prevent a bit the exposure to risk if they're able to absorb somewhat high-level technologies. And even in the context of forced displacement, we have to focus, of course, on those that are being displaced, but also in the communities that are hosting this new wave of people, and how are their livelihoods being stranded or impacted by displacement? Are we to ensure that those communities have access to social protection, but also to complementary packages of livelihoods that can help to diversify their assets and therefore better cope with potential risks? And we're talking about very different contexts, very different types of countries where these risks and shocks are happening. I guess from one spectrum, countries like Ethiopia or Kenya that have recurrent shocks, predictable shocks in terms of droughts, in terms of flood, that we know that due the context of the country, every year we're going to be exposed to a specific risk. So these are predictable. We are able to identify what are the risks and what are the potential impacts. And therefore, we can define a response that is addressing some of these potential impacts. And working towards designing what we've called very long, in a long way, risk-informed and shock-responsive social protection systems, or adapted systems, as some other colleagues will also refer to. Taking advantage of the fact that we have strong systems in many countries that already done a lot of effort and invested a lot of resources in reaching or targeting the most vulnerable in terms of economic and social dimensions, that in most of the time are also the most vulnerable in terms of exposure to climate risk and conflict. Using that mechanism to use that mechanism to respond to a crisis, and using those systems to have either a top-up or expanding the support to address the specific impacts of the risk, or to expand the number of people also in a short-term basis that in addition to those covered by the social protection program are also impacted by the specific risk or shocks. It's a way, I think, in our perspective, to making sure that we are not always having to come with a humanitarian response, which is short-term and expensive, but using as much as possible existing systems to enhance the efficiency of. Oh, I've been drawn. Oh, that's so cool. Wow. So everything it's so wow, impressive. Sorry. And there are different components, get distracted. Very different components that will make this system more risk-informed and shock-responsive. First element, we all know that social protection programs, particularly social assistance programs, are prioritizing, and rightfully so, economic and social characteristics and identifying who are the most vulnerable in those settings, particularly when we're talking about targeted programs, although we can have a discussion on that. It will be important also to add additional elements, so to also understand that there are other types of risks that could be addressed by a social protection program. So how can we overlap with those areas that are also more exposed to climate-related risks? So in addition to including poverty and social dimensions, we can also include environmental type information and indicators that can maybe expand our target base and include those that are exposed. Can we think about contingency funding mechanisms that could be in place and protected and used in order to either expand top up the existing transfer, or expand those that are being reached and benefited, and being used only in the event of a specific crisis? How can we bring together, for example, all the work that the disaster agencies, the early warning systems have, that can help to identify better triggers, so that when a shock happens, the response is not given after the shock, but before, and therefore helping families to better prepare when a specific shock happens. So an example in Lesotho, where the government has a very strong child grant program, a very strong management information system, and at the same time, there is an early warning incipient work that now we're trying to bring them together to be able to define triggers. And now that we know that unfortunately El Niño probably is going to hit again in a few months, we can provide support to families that are going to be, unfortunately, we already know, affected by some of the negative effects of El Niño, with some additional support to help them to cope better with those risks. It's not the only solution. It's not going to, of course, in all cases, remove the need for humanitarian aid, but it's definitely going to help to decrease the number of caseloads around support and around response. But I think more importantly, it's also trying to bring our humanitarian colleagues closer to the development agenda to understand or to jointly define a work around humanitarian response that is not only around aftermath and post-shock, but thinking about prevention, thinking about resilience, thinking about enhancing capacity before crisis happened to enhance, if you want, the response. And this is, of course, when we're talking about predictable crisis, which is mainly around climate-related risks. And when we're talking about conflict, it's a different dimension that is not always predictable and identifiable, and requires other types of mechanisms. But we also have, unfortunately, in many of the regions, contexts that are countries that do not have an existing social protection system, and where there's no room to make anything more responsive or risk-informed. So unfortunately, countries like South Sudan and Somalia, where there's constant need for emergency response. What can we do in those settings? Last year, we had a big discussion around particularly that area. Now, what is the role of social protection in context of extreme fragility or forced displacement, where there's no systems in place, when we need to start from scratch? And the work there is, how can we take advantage of or use the highly sophisticated elements and structures that agencies, humanitarian agencies, NGOs are putting forth to deliver aid, to start thinking of building some sort of a nascent system or strategy. And this is what's actually happening in Somalia. Actors are coming together to first identify how the different systems that they're using to deliver cash, can they come together, become compatible, and then help a government to design some sort of a structure that can help them to also deliver response when needed in particular areas. How can we bring together the subnational structures that are also dealing with response towards working in a much more coordinated solution around response? It's a very, of course, complex and progressive pathway, but it's trying to understand that we need to find a way to have a much more medium-term, if you want, response to predictable transfer. So we talk about building nascent systems or nascent structures to help and to facilitate response. Am I on time? like really bad? No, good, okay. Again, a lot of information, a lot of ideas. But I think the first part is trying to put into context that when we design and we think about social protection, it's important and it's key to make sure that we have, a rights-based approach, that we understand that everybody has a right to social protection. Our messages from the rural sector is like, identify the different characteristics of those communities to be able to identify the most adequate social protection programs, giving not only socioeconomic characteristics, but also livelihoods. What a fisher community needs in terms of protection is very different to what a crop community or somebody in the urban sectors will need. How can we understand that? And the second point or idea is around the impacts that a social protection program can have as a social program, not only in terms of social impacts such as education and health and nutrition, but also enhancing the economic and productive capacity of even the poorest and the more vulnerable farmers. And in that way, contributing to progressively move and help them to move them out of poverty. And this is not just from a conceptual perspective and from, rationale, but it's actually based on the evidence that we've collected around the years. And evidence that it's meant to support the overarching argument around the right to social protection, but evidence that in many times help to make the argument stronger. I think that you've been exposed to some of this in a session before with my colleagues in UNICEF, but we can talk about it again. Around the very important work that was done, particularly focusing in Africa, but now expanding, on understanding the impacts of social cash transfers, particularly of national cash transfer programs. For many years, most of the evidence came from my region, from Latin America, which had a very specific design of programs, most of them conditional cash transfers, very specific design in terms of the characteristics and also the poverty profile, if you want, of the exclusion profile of that region. In Africa, we have a very different type of programs. Even when we compare East and West Africa, the types of programs that have been developed are very different, and of course, context specific. Now, for example, less conditional, more focused on community participation, taking advantage of the wealth of community support and non-formal social protection systems that exist in the African continent. In many cases responding to food insecurity or to the impacts of HIV/AIDS, for instance. So we had a very different type of program, a very different type of approach, and it was important to also develop context-specific evidence around the impact of these programs. And the first focus was to focus on the program's objectives in terms of consumption, food security, dietary diversity, school enrollment, and health. And our colleagues from UNICEF were the ones that focusing on assessing the impacts of these programs in those sets of results. And we came into the picture trying to expand the question and basically ask, can a social program have also economic and productive impacts? And can these impacts be not only within the program participants, but can we see or expect any impacts across the local economy? And the answer was yes. Very strong evidence across the countries identified, which continues to repeat itself in many of the countries that we work on. The clear impact on food access, on dietary diversity, the clear impact on education enrollment, the obvious impact around access to health, but also a very strong impact on how communities were using those resources and investing in their own economic activities. If they had land, in agriculture inputs, in hiring better labor. If they did not have land, in using those resources to rent land or to define non-land-based entrepreneurial activities in terms of, that can help them to also generate some resources. Even the labor-constrained communities, the grandmothers that were taking care of their grandchildren in mixed-generation communities were using those resources to pay somebody to help them work on their land and generate some additional income. we use this evidence to also address some of the myths that are coming out of that some of our colleagues in government have around social protection. I understand that was also discussed yesterday, and I hope you were able to see the video at the beginning. No, we're not talking about people that are dependent, that are lazy, that are just waiting for transfers to cover every month. We're seeing that these are resources that are being invested in paying debt, in paying immediate needs, but also progressively being invested in activities that can enhance their specific livelihoods. Influencing labor choices to better labor choices, but not necessarily reducing work effort. So those questions about we're creating disincentives to work and we're creating people that are going to be dependent on transfers. Beneficiaries are not beneficiaries, participants work differently, but not less. And also all the questions around increased fertility and consumption of alcohol, those were also very strongly taken out of the equation with the impact that we show. We saw that there were impacts across domains, very broad impacts, but we also realized there was a need to complement those impacts to be able to sustain them on time, but most importantly to maximize the potential impacts that you could see out of them. And they were able to transform some of the dynamics in terms of improving human capital, which in many contexts was the main focus of these programs, but also to provide some certainty and to remove some of the constraints that were not allowing farmers in rural areas to enhance their productive potential. And the very obvious, but I think important message that you cannot separate, livelihoods from consumption. You cannot separate social objectives from economic objectives when we're talking and working with families that are living maybe mainly at subsistence levels. And as I mentioned, the impacts in the local economy, cash that is spent in the community, which is setting in motion some of the income multipliers across sectors. You have increased demand that needs to be met somewhere, creating, a very strong argument around the investment of programs, not only to impact participants of those programs, but a wider set of beneficiaries across the community. So I think by now, I hope, we have a clear idea of the importance on the contribution. We're not here, I'm not here to make a case that it's going to solve all the issues around rural development or food security and nutrition, but it's a very important component to be able to allow those that are in much more vulnerable situations to get a better chance at reducing, of moving out of poverty. But it's not only key in the rural sector, it's not only key for those that are poor and vulnerable. It's key for the whole agriculture sector, even the first group of farmers that we talked about, which are commercial and medium scale. The specificity of the sector requires a very strong focus on risk management. Risk that is inherent in the sector and that requires different types of instruments, including social protection, to address that. Putting forth and starting from the rights-based approach of it's a right for everybody, it's also very specific to the needs and characteristics of different types of farmers. However, the access continues to be limited, and I think there's been a lot of the lead organization that is providing all this information around access, of course, is the ILO. Given with all of its world reports, a very clear messages around, we're doing okay, but we still have a big gap in terms of access. Well, 45% of the population still doesn't have, a proper access to social protection. Social assistance for the rural sectors continues to be, has broadest coverage vis-a-vis social insurance. But there's a big gap. The rural sectors are ones that are having a very big gap in terms of all the sets of different types of social protection instruments. And unfortunately, it is in the agriculture sector, because it's non-formal, where the gap between assistance and insurance, so between contributory and not contributory, becomes bigger. And where unfortunately the risk is also higher, given the situation and the characteristics of the sector. Just to give an example of, that was, and I'm stealing examples from the ILO report, if I may, around a particular group in the rural areas, which is the aging population, right? We have a very strong statement that there is a big percentage of people, and there's been a big improvement around the access of all age pensions around those that are more than 68 years of age. But for some reason, in the rural area, there's still a perception that those benefits do not reach them, that they're not accessible, that they're not enough, that they're not covering the different needs or the different parts of the population. Similarly, in terms of health coverage, there is access, but it's not enough. There is still a big gap in terms of who are accessing critical health insurance programs across the rural areas. And again, this is not a matter of poor or not poor. It's a matter of a sector that is not adequately covered by specific social protection packages. And it also has a very interesting, unfortunately, interesting implications for issues around youth employment and youth participation in the rural and agriculture sector. We have a growing aging population that needs to continue working because it's the only way to generate income. They don't have adequate access to pensions or health insurance, and therefore are not allowing younger generations to take over the agriculture sector and, if you want, change the pace of the sector. It's a key issue around in many countries in the rural sectors. For youth, it's a very similar situation. We have very limited programs that are specifically targeted to address the vulnerabilities of youth that are leaving out of school, that they don't find new jobs in the formal labor sector, and that they don't have particular protection packages. There are some in terms of, for example, unemployment benefits for first-time job seekers, but again, it's most of the time constrained to the formal sector or to very specific urban centers and countries. Why is it why is it complex to access social protection in rural sectors? One of the things or issues that we're looking at, and we're trying to identify some of these barriers, is even where there are social protection systems in place, even though the legislation of a country says everybody has the right to access social protection systems, there's a problem of lack of inadequacy, I cannot pronounce that word, inadequacy, of benefits specific to the livelihoods and the characteristics of those in the agriculture sector, across sectors. Inadequacy in terms of size and the correspondence based on specific livelihoods. Most of the time, but I think this is changing, most of the social insurance based on labor is not necessarily applicable to a sector that is not formalized within the labor law, which is the agriculture sector. Access, very obvious issues around access in the rural settings. Not only quality, but just access of basic, services in terms of health, insurance, and others that are not physically available in rural settings. And even more when we're talking about populations that live in the Amazon, that live in high mountains, very, very, very critical barriers around that. There is also, unfortunately, lack of trust in many of our governments or many of our countries in terms of the system and the perceptions that, these are not relevant, these are not really tailored to my specific needs. And as I think part of the work that we have to do in trying to bring these services when they exist closer to the needed communities. The nature of agricultural employment is very different to urban type employment in terms of, seasonality, in terms of, when do we need more resources in the year, when I'm in the crop season, where do I need additional resources and additional protection? Is it a question of the structure of the social security system? Is it a question of the sector? Is there a way to bring them closer together and without, of course, disturbing the whole system or creating fragmented responses across sector. We don't want, or we're not trying to say that we need different packages for different type of livelihoods, but at least to be able to have a broader understanding on that there are different types of population that we need to reach and we need to benefit through these programs. We don't have the solution yet. But we're working toward identifying ways or components that can help to close these barriers together. And it's something that we are starting to work very closely with the ILO in doing two things. In first, visibility and putting on very clear paper, this is the nature and the scope of the coverage gap in rural areas. These are the communities, these are the people that are not being adequately covered. This is why, these are their specific characteristics and vulnerabilities. This is how a fisherman is very different from one working in forests or one working in crops, and why you need to make sure that the systems are able to respond equally to them. The importance of farmers' registries. In a context where there is access, at least on paper, to social protection programs, but farmers are not visible, therefore they're not part of any registration mechanism. There's no registry in the country. It's very difficult for them to access any type of service. And to link that information into social registries and information around Social Security. Can we work to build those registries and to include information that is not only particular to the agriculture sector, but broaden it to include also socioeconomic characteristics of farmers that could then help us to go to the Ministry of Labor and say, these are communities that are registered, that we know who they are, and that need this specific type of benefit. So it's trying to bring ways to bringing closer together the needs of a sector with the supply and the benefits that are already existing in a particular country. And the course next week is going to go into depth on what do we mean by registers and what are the way of linking them with the social registries. Can we think about alternative protection modalities flexible enough that can take into account the diversity of the non-formal sector and their characteristics? Not to replace, not to work in conflicts with the national structures, but provide the governments with alternatives that they can also take up to better serve these communities. Because of the gap, there's been a lot of NGOs, communities, farmers organizations that have come together and designed their own mutual funds, their own farmer funds and insurance funds due to a gap to avoid. And it's not a question of making these to replace a government, but using that expertise and those lessons learned to then build something at national level. It's not we need to continue, pushing our governments that they are the ones that are going to protect these communities. They're the duty bearers, if you want, around social protection, but give them also the means and the information that can help them to respond better. And there's where it's critical to have much more stronger dialogue and linkage with the Agriculture Ministry, with the Fisheries Ministry, the LEFTA sector, that have all this technical expertise and understanding around specific vulnerabilities of the sector that can help a labor ministry, a social protection ministry to better design their programs. If we're only focusing on one particular sector, we're only going to respond to one particular sector. And that's it. And I think across the board or across the presentation, the message has been around. It's important, but it requires to be integrated when I talk about social protection between broader strategies and really trying to think about the systems approach to social protection. A system that can link the different social protection instruments into a comprehensive, integrated system, but also to make sure that we're creating the effective linkages with other sectors that can also contribute to a broader scheme. So we have to link with health because we have health insurance. We need to link with education because we have school fees and school feeding. We have to link with also, I will say, the agriculture sector because we also need to bring into the dimension of social protection those programs that are functioning under the leadership of the agriculture ministries, for example, input subsidies, or other types of subsidies, to also come into the package and have a much more broader integrated understanding around social protection. Understanding the needs for different packages across different economic groups, but also livelihood groups. And we think about this, idea of social protection plus or CUTCH plus, where social protection is a core package, but that in order to make sure that the impacts that we're seeing are sustained and are maximized, we need to forge effective linkages with other sectors. And that is, I think, where the rhetoric versus the practice become the challenge. So what are the incentives for coordination? What are the ways to make sure that we have health, education, and agriculture talking together to be able to work around a comprehensive social protection strategy? And that's, again, another thing we will discuss in the elective. So sign up. So just because we have to do some overall, I think the agriculture sector has something to contribute to social protection. The specificities, as I was saying, of livelihoods, the specificity of the sector, but also the other side, let's say, or the other contribution of social protection to the Agenda 2030, in addition to social impacts, in addition to environmental impacts, if possible, also the productive element and the productive impacts, the promotive function of social protection, maximizing that and making sure that we have families that are able to effectively move out of poverty. When we talk about SDG 1.3, which is our target around social protection, when we talk about effective reach, that also should include the rural poor. Social protection floors that are adapted to also the characteristics of the rural areas. And a case, and the sector helps to identify what does that mean in practice. I think the idea of widening the audience around discussing social protection to also bring sectors that maybe traditionally are a bit, not comfortable in talking about social issues. I'm sure you've had these problems when you're discussing with your counterparts in agriculture ministries. No, we don't deal with the poor farmers. We only deal with the commercial, industrial type farmers. And we have a case to make saying, actually, no. These are part of the broader set of beneficiaries and participants that require and need also social protection programs. Maybe not the same as the ones that you are identifying in your ministry, but there's a need to have a comprehensive perspective around that. And all, of course, to say that we're working towards the same objectives around nationally owned social protection systems. In my contribution is that let's not forget the specificities of a sector that is also as vulnerable and as risk prone as many others. And I think I end here. Yes, thank you very much. What do I do? Yeah. I stay here? Okay.
Yeah. So yeah, we already have a few questions coming through on the Slido that came through during the presentation. I encourage those who want to ask questions to keep on sending them through. I think even those watching the live stream can also access the questions and share them now, have the information. And similarly, if there's any questions up there that you also agree with that you'd particularly like Natalia to address, then you can vote for which ones you're most interested in. Well, I think you can start. I mean, there's already one, the one at the top, which seems to be particularly.
And they're anonymous, so I cannot say you asked me that.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
Well, first, thank you for the attention, because if there are questions, that mean that you were listening. Thank you. So I have here 8 people want to know, what is the best strategy to ensure farmers being covered in SP systems, since this group is too vast and scattered? Yes, and that's, I think, the core of what we should discuss today. No, I'm not here to say what is the best strategy. It's what is in the particular context of your country will be the best entry points to make sure that this is happening. So first, who are the farmers, who are the self-employed, and what are their characteristics? Do we have a farmer registry that can identify that, can provide information that can then be used to start a discussion with those that are managing or owning the social protection system, in, for example, the Ministry of Labor or the Ministry of Social Protection where it exists. When we talk about the scatter and the vast group, exactly, what are the different livelihoods and the different characteristics, and what are the programs that exist or that need to be created to address those issues? If we have a cash transfer program that is covering most of the country, for instance, are those in the rural areas, are they being covered? And if they are, is the way that the cash is being delivered every month, is it suitable for their specific needs or not? And I think the best strategy is not going to come from me. It's not going to come from FAO. It's not going to come probably from you. It should come also from a discussion with those that are the potential participants or the potential beneficiaries of programs. So what are the key needs that they're identifying in their context, in their communities? What are being met and which ones are not? Which also creates not only for you the information to design a better response, but also the trust that I was talking about, the trust on those potential beneficiaries to see that there's a government, there's a structure that is trying to respond to those specific needs. No? 4. Quel programme de protection sociale est mis en place pour l'Afrique? Je parle un peu de français. But I'm not going to answer in French because you won't understand what I'm saying. So yes, West Africa, there's many countries in West Africa that are starting to also identify and design and put in place social protection programs. I think it's fair to say that the continent is very diverse. So we have the well-established, long-standing programs in Southern Africa, now in Namibia and South Africa, even in Lesotho, we'll say, that have been there for a long time, that are systems that are broad, that are covering different communities. Then we have the emerging of the East Africa region, where you have countries that are increasingly investing their own resources in programs, Kenya, Zambia, Malawi, trying to really expand their programs. I think in East Africa, if it's fair to say, that there's been a big push around cash transfer programs, although thankfully now there's a bigger discussion around systems and around pensions and around the other types of elements that are also key and essential around a bigger social protection program. In West Africa, what I've been seeing with the exception of maybe 2 countries, which are, I guess, the leaders in the sub-region, which is Senegal and Ghana, which they have structures of social protection where they've designed their social protection strategies and policies, but they've been, at the forefront of designing comprehensive policies. They've also been using the cash transfer as the main flagship program and then opening up to other programs. We also see Burkina, Mali, Niger with the 3N, many countries that also have been designing new programs. I think a lot of the characteristics of the region is trying to also respond not only to economic and social vulnerabilities, but there's a lot of focus around resilience, so adaptive programs that are able to respond to crisis. So the design of the 3N, for example, in Niger is really looking at nutrition and the risk informed, if you want, systems around that country. So the question was if there were programs with Africa. Yes, they are. And with growing or emerging with very different characteristics, which is great, responding to the needs of that sector. So I just start answering everything that comes.
You could,
okay.
Perhaps choose the ones that are...
No, they're all interesting.
Yeah.
Very interesting. Which programs have the potential to respond before crises? The operational evidence that we've been able to do at this moment have been focused on 2 types of programs, one being cash and the other one being school feeding programs. And the ones that I'm more familiar with are cash. So that doesn't say that I'm saying these are the only programs able to respond to crisis, but these are the ones that we've seen and used in countries like Kenya, in countries like Philippines, in Lesotho, in my own country, in Peru, where there's, given that most of the time those are the flagship programs or the ones that have received more attention for good or for bad, they have a structure and they are strong enough to be able to be used to, as I said, other top-ups, so give additional resources to those that are already included in the program, or to expand the reach and also start benefiting for a short period of time other communities that have been affected or would be potentially affected by a particular crisis. The importance here is that the program needs to have all the elements to be able to do that. So either have better linkages with the disaster risk agency, for example, with the early warning programs, to have the capacity to have that response timely. The challenges around the time frame on how a government can respond versus an agency that can come and just, very quickly provide the assistance needed. And we need to make sure that there is, that we enhance the capacity of government so that happens. We don't want to have parallel systems. We don't want to have a government trying to respond while at the same time have an agency coming and do, similar thing and maybe creating, conflict between communities that are receiving maybe, stronger or higher respond in terms of resources versus what the government can provide. So it's also a question of coordination, using the expertise of agencies, humanitarian agencies that are working very strongly around response, and using that expertise to enhance existing systems when it's possible and when they exist, of course. No? Expérience n'est pas passée par le temps. I don't understand that question. They're not good. That there's no impact on food security, on CCTs?
Do any of our native French speakers want to or if the person who answered the question wants to clarify?
I think what it says is that the experience of the countries is that they're not.
Are there I guess it's the bad examples of cash transfers having less positive impacts.
I think on food security, it's been, from the evidence that we've seen, it's been pretty, confirmed without the countries. That there's an increased access in consumption of food and to diversity of food. The mixed evidence is around when you want to also see nutrition impacts, anthropometric impacts on stunting, impacts on wasting. For the obvious reasons that nutrition is a multi-sectoral approach, and therefore the cash and the access to food is also one element within a much more broader, multidimensional framework of nutrition, which also needs health, care, and other, and most importantly, changes in issues like stunting take time. With the impact of cash is sometimes only immediate, which I think is linked to the question that comes here around the long-term impacts of cash transfers. And that, I think, that is the question that right now is, at the mind of many of us, including the researchers. Now, we've seen impacts in many of these countries. We've seen important impacts in the short and medium term. Countries that have had this program from longer time, for example, Mexico, have seen that, yes, there's impacts, but there's a point where those impacts they're stalemate, because there hasn't been an additional, if you want, complementary support to make sure that those impacts are sustained. Access to education is important, but then if the quality of the education is not ideal, the impacts of the cash are, of course, limited. Because we cannot ask the cash transfers to change the quality of the education of the health system. We need to, as again, put it within a broader set of policies to really see impacts in the medium term, in the long term, but also to fulfill the impacts of those transfers. No, of course not. The issue of food security, it's not just a rural issue. It's, of course, something that is of the domain of both urban and rural settings. I wanted to put forth the rural dimension because usually we forget about it. And because in the rural sectors, not only around the food security of those beneficiaries, but also on how the food systems can better respond to that increase in demand. How can we promote that agriculture is not just for productive means, but also to promote, for instance, nutrition-sensitive type agriculture that can add an additional layer around maximizing food security and nutrition. So it's of course a domain of both sectors, but I was trying to emphasize the importance of the rural sector.
I think if we do the last question, if you
Yes.
then have any kind of final.
So I can
summary
choose.
points.
So do I find normal that some countries have a fertile soil? I don't know. I need to, take more classes of French, apparently.
It's this one.
For the financing of programs, I think you have a session on that, right? Financing of social protection. So I'll leave that session to respond to that. Because it's one that has them more, that's why I wanted to answer that, but I can.
All right, Natalia, are you looking for the translation of the second question?
Yes, sorry.
Pretty much here, they're mentioning there are some countries that they're very fertile lands and everything. And the question is, should we not give them better training so that they could actually cultivate the land and be sufficient by cultivating the land here?
Okay. Training and enhancing capacity it's a part of it, but if you don't have the mean to invest in that soil, if you don't have the mean to make sure that the soil continues to be healthy, it's the chicken and the egg. No, we're talking about families that I said at the beginning need to make a choice between eating or sending kids to school or investing in my livelihood. And that is unfortunately a separation that it's not able to be made when you are at a very subsistent level. So yes, self-sufficiency, we all want to be self-sufficient, but we also have to be realistic on what is the situation of those communities despite where they live. No? And self-sufficiency is important, but I was also trying to say that even when you get self-sufficient, you're also facing multiple risks that are inherent of the sector. You still need to have protection, and you still have the right to be able to access different types of social protection, but maybe are not cashed anymore, but they will change into pension, into health insurance, into other types of mechanisms that are still needed. So yes, training is important, and the complementary interventions, once families are able to invest in their lands, and great if they're fertile, around training and seeds, but I think it's one step further to ask for that. First, we need to have a minimum base of livelihood to be able to have those results. So.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, and thanks again to Natalia, not only for the presentation, but